Hello, and welcome to CQ Roll Call's anniversary celebration. I'm Josh Resnick, the Chief Content Officer for Fiscal Note and CQ Roll Call. For the past 75 and 65 years, respectively, CQ and Roll Call have been trusted to deliver the right news at the right time. To every congressional office, the vast majority of federal agencies, and thousands of organizations. Today, we celebrate the CQ Roll Call legacy by reconnecting with some of the people who contributed to our story along the way, reflecting on the unique and trying year this has been, and looking forward to what's ahead for the future of news. To kick off our program, Jason Dick, our CQ Roll Call Deputy Editor, will be speaking with 3 of our newsroom alumni about their time with CQ Roll Call. With that, here's Jason Dick.
Former Congressman Martin Frost, thank you for joining us and talking about some of your experiences as a CQer before an illustrious career in law and public service. It's great to have you. Thank you for accepting our invitation to muse about your time, not just as a consumer of CQ and Roll Call, but as an employee.
Yes, it's an offer I couldn't refuse.
I feel like for people who are in the Beltway, most everybody is familiar. You know, if you work in public policy with CQ and Roll Call, sometimes it might be difficult to get outside of that bubble. But if you were speaking to, say, some students at your alma mater at Mizzou, what would you tell them about journalism if they wanted to cover public policy and be involved in that as you were? What would be your advice?
Well, I would tell them, first of all, about my career at CQ. I was there for a little bit less than 2 years. I started in June of 65 and left in March of 67 to go to do basic training in the Army at Fort Dix in New Jersey. I would tell them that the time at CQ was invaluable to me because I learned more about politics working for CQ and government than I could ever have learned in school. In fact, people used to joke at the time that working for CQ was the equivalent of getting a master's in politics and government. And it also made me much more careful and precise in my writing. Because I've been a little sloppy sometimes initially as a journalist. You couldn't be sloppy at CQ. You had to have everything straight and right. And so it was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot about how Congress operates. And as a result, when I was elected to Congress in 1978, I already knew something about how the place operated. The time that I spent covering Congress and writing for CQ made me a better public servant, I believe.
What would, if you were, if you're just talking to somebody maybe starting out in their career in journalism, what would be the one sort of incident or story about how you did things in the CQ newsroom in the 1960s that they just wouldn't believe?
Back then, this was before C-SPAN, so you couldn't sit around and watch the proceedings of the House on television, but very few reporters from CQ actually went up to the Hill at that time. We sat around and read the congressional record and read congressional testimony, found the right staffers to talk to on committees to explain to us exactly what was going on, what it meant, and what we could expect. And so it was just an extraordinary experience. And some of the people that I worked with later, either people who were already there or later came on board, turned out to have very important careers in national journalism. It was an ideal stepping stone for someone, a young person who wanted to have a career at a serious publication in journalism. And as I said, some of these people had government backgrounds, some of them had journalism backgrounds, but at that time, there was not a better training ground for a career in Washington politics and journalism than working at CQ.
Well, Congressman Martin Frost, thank you so much for talking about your time at CQ and politics. We look forward to talking to you again. And thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Tamar Hallerman, you were my colleague at CQ a few years back. You have since gone on to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, first in their Washington bureau, and now you are down in Hotlanta itself to do on-the-ground reporting and writing there. Welcome. Thank you for coming on and talking a little bit about your time at CQ.
Thanks so much for having me. It was one of my favorite jobs I ever had, and I'm so happy to get to talk about it.
Cool. Yeah. Let's talk about some of what you did at CQ, because you had arguably one of the, if not the most important beat that CQ covers, which is budget and appropriations. Just talk about like what's maybe arguably the most stressful time for a budget approps reporter for CQ, and what goes through your process in that time.
Sure, of course, it was the omnibus Christmas that we would inevitably have every year. Inevitably, the deadline for government funding is September 30th, and inevitably every year they'd push it back a month, push it back another month. So inevitably, we'd be getting right at the end of the Congress. They're trying to go on their Christmas, their New Year's holidays, and they still have to do something on government spending. So we'd be waiting for days and days. That last week would be so intense because we wouldn't know exactly when they dropped this bill, which would be thousands of pages, more than $1 trillion in government spending, funding every corner of the government. And so you spend days writing these stories, this important person says the bill will come out on Wednesday. Just kidding, Wednesday night, actually Thursday. And so when it does actually come, it's often late at night. Everyone in the CQ newsroom is kind of waiting for your signal to say, okay, here's the bill. You have to pick up a physical copy of it in the Senate because they're not putting it online, and get that scanned for our readers. And then you have to send it out to staff, and everybody just starts going through it. You're racing to get something online as soon as possible. And you're trying to find all those goodies that are buried deep down in there that lawmakers might not want you to see, but might be giant changes in law. All these political fights, I'm covering now the Georgia's two twin Senate runoffs right now. All these fights and all these attack ads, it does come down to often policy and what these lawmakers are doing behind the scenes. And where else are you going to get a better front row seat than getting to cover it in person, or I guess remotely now, but to cover it for a place like Roll Call, where it really is just meat and potatoes. And frankly, it gives you a better education than I think anywhere else in Washington does in terms of how things work, in terms of how committees work, how conference committees and budget negotiations. And there's a level of precision that's expected at CQ Roll Call that I don't think most other newspapers really cherish, but it's something that I know my sources really treasure, and it's helped me build new relationships when they realize, hey, she's kind of a policy geek too, she gets it. And it's really helped me, even as I've moved on down here.
Thank you so much, Tamar.
Yes, good luck.
Christina Bellantoni, you're a former editor-in-chief of Roll Call, and because you couldn't get quite enough of the place, you actually did 2 stints at CQ Roll Call. In between, you did you were a producer at the PBS NewsHour. You went to the LA Times after your time at Roll Call, and you're currently a professor at the University of Southern California and its Annenberg Institute. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us about your time at CQ Roll Call and what it meant to you, and how it continues to kind of be a part of your life.
My pleasure. I really feel strongly, a lot of strong, warm feelings for everything about the place, and I'm happy to be here.
Much. Well, one thing that I've been asking people about in these alumni interviews is, what's a newsroom kind of story that you could tell where your students would be, that's not true, that never happened, that could never have happened. What's your veteran news person story where they would just be completely baffled that was a part of it, whether it's smoking or typewriters or things like that?
Yeah, I feel like there was a lot in my first stint at Roll Call when the Republicans took over when they won in 2010 and took over in 2011. Oh my God, I'm going to blank on his name. The guy who threatened to throw the reporter off the balcony.
Michael Grimm.
Yes,
former FBI special agent Michael Grimm, who
that was a big one.
Yeah.
I often tell students 2 stories, and I don't know how whether they believe them or not. Hopefully they do. One about when Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Alan West were in a fight, and it was one of those kind of first real cable news catnip back and forth. He said something nasty. Did he apologize? Didn't he apologize? We had this story that he had apologized, and our reporting was solid on it from one of our reporters. And both staffs the Debbie Wasserman Schultz staff and the Alan West staff like asked us not to do the story because they were making so much money on fundraising off the attention that it wasn't like good for either of them to kind of cool the temperatures. And it was just very strange to see that. And it really made you realize like Washington's pretty broken right now. So there's that. And then obviously you'll remember very well the night, June 2014, when Eric Cantor lost his primary. And, we were like putting the finishing touches on the front page. Cantor wasn't even in the paper that day. And, started to hear something's happening. Our politics editor, got in touch. We're starting to like take a look at the numbers, like he's about to lose. And so we just had to basically say, stop the presses. We rewrote the front page. We picked this giant photo with giant headline, 101 point font. I will never forget. Stunner.
Yep.
And, not only were we lucky that we had a great front page that reflected what had happened, because it happened, late on deadline and not every other outlet was able to do that in print. But also like we were able to pull in all of our expertise. At the time, David Hawkins was able to, look up, all this different history about majority leaders and primaries. And then I remember Jay Hunter, I believe, is the one who found the stat that no majority leader ever in the entire history of the position had lost their seat in a primary. And things like that just made CQ Roll Call so valuable to people. And then really that next day was just even more valuable because we sent out our reporters to talk about like the sort of shock wave on the Hill. And the photo that we chose was this young staffer just like crushed, leaning up against a wall. And I keep that on my wall in my office because it was just such a reminder of like, that's what this community was about that Roll Call was covering at the time. And that's a really good way to approach news coverage, is to understand like how people are affected by election results, by policy decisions, by votes. All of those things do have this like really important ripple effect. And if you can get at that human impact, you're going to be fine as a journalist.
I remember so well that night, when you called up, our printer and said, stop the presses. We have to reconfigure this. And then also the photo that you're mentioning about one of Cantor's young staffers that I included that photo in a book also of roll call photography published a couple of years back, and it was taken by our, one of our inestimable photographer colleagues, Tom Williams, and knowing who that was, Kay Prue, and why, where she would be, and focusing on that instead of just the headshot of Cantor at a lectern. I think is one of those things that like we get to do, in this place that I just love. I love it. And I love that, you wanted a photo of a staffer, in this very human moment, as opposed to one of the majority leader surrounded by microphones. I mean, I think that is a real distinguishing feature that we offer. Well, Christina, thank you so much again. I really, value our time together working at Roll Call. I learned a lot. I'm glad that we've continued to stay in touch, and I wish you all the best with your students. They're lucky to have somebody with your wealth of experience, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. I love everybody there. Really treasured all my time there, and hope to come visit in Washington sooner rather than later. Take care.
Wow, thank you, Jason. And thank you, Congressman Frost, Tamar, and Christina for joining us today and for all your contributions to our newsroom. One thing is for sure, we owe the success and longevity of CQ and Roll Call to the dedicated and talented individuals who work day and night to bring you the best political reporting in DC. With that in mind, I want to say a huge thank you to all the people who make the CQ Roll Call engine work, to our journalists, editors, production staff, technology teams, sales and marketing teams, and business teams. None of this would be possible without everyone doing their part. This is especially true in 2020 with the exceptional challenges and disruptions we've faced. We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to our CQ Roll Call journalists and journalists around the world who do whatever it takes to bring their readers the truth. And of course, to our loyal readers, we are so grateful for your continued support for all these years. On behalf of the CQ Roll Call and Fiscal Note family, I want to say thank you, and I hope you continue to enjoy this celebration. Up next, our Editor-in-Chief, Catalina Camilla, moderates a panel discussion on the future of news. She is joined by Jessica Yellen, Katie Drummond, and Anna Sedgley. Catalina, over to you.
Hello, and welcome to CQ Roll Call's anniversary celebration. I'm Catalina Camilla, the editor-in-chief of CQ Roll Call, and it's my honor today to moderate this panel about the future of news. Joining me are three women who have been change agents in an ever-evolving industry. Each is an innovator, confronting challenges that seem to threaten journalism at a time when we need it the most. I'd like to introduce you to Katie Drummond, Senior Vice President for Global News at Vice Media, the digital media and broadcasting company with channels for news, culture, health, and a whole bunch of other topics that are geared toward young adults. Previously, Katie was an editor at Medium, executive editor for The Outline, and editor-in-chief of Gizmodo. Hi, Katie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Jessica Yellen, a former chief White House correspondent for CNN and the founder of News Not Noise. Jessica is really her own media organization, and she's using Instagram in ways to change the way news is delivered and consumed. In her journalism career, Jessica has also reported for ABC News and MSNBC, and last year she wrote her first novel, Savage News. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And last but not least, we are joined by Anna Sedgley, a former chief operating officer of Dow Jones, as well as the publishing company's chief financial officer. Anna is now with Affinity, a data and software company that is developing artificial intelligence for a variety of uses. And I hope a little later on in this program, we'll be talking about another hat that Anna wears when we get to the topic of how to grow the next generation of journalists. Hi, Anna.
Hi, thanks for having me. Happy birthday, CQ Roll Call.
Thank you very much. Ladies, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join me in this conversation about the future of news and the future of journalism. And I want to set the stage by talking about what we've all talked about, which is just the incredible year we're having in 2020. It has been such a dramatic and disruptive time. There have been so many storylines that grab our attention, whether it's a global pandemic, a historic presidential election, a reckoning about race, and even, eons ago, back in January, the impeachment trial of President Trump. It's clear that journalism matters and is very much in demand. But the news industry is fighting a host of financial battles, including a steep drop in advertising that didn't begin this year, but only accelerated further downward. The loss of some 11,000 jobs in journalism, and the consolidation of many media companies. So I'd like to ask you all first this question, and it's a rather broad one, but how do we change this course? What do we need to do as journalism and media organizations and leaders to ensure that we're viable and vibrant for years to come? Katie, let's start with you.
Sure. I don't think there are easy answers to this question, right? I mean, if we had them, we would not be in the position that we're in as media organizations, broadly speaking. I think the biggest two priorities that stand out to me are one, and it sounds boring, but it's incredibly important, which is diversified revenue streams, right? I mean, I think that no media company, no digital media outlet, which is really where I focus my attention, can survive on one source of revenue alone. Advertising dollars are not going to do it. I don't know that, solely focusing on subscription models is going to do it. I think there's no one size fits all approach across the landscape. And then I think the second piece of it is that the tech companies that are gobbling up more and more of the ad dollars year after year need to be held accountable in some way, shape, or form for sharing that revenue in some fashion with the media outlets that are actually providing the content that is really feeding those machines. So I think those are the two elements that stand out to me.
I want to get back to that idea about accountability after I bring in Anna. What are your thoughts about how we change course?
Yeah, I'd answer the question in two parts. So, first of all, just in terms of readership and consumption of news, I think that 2020 has been an incredible period where people are accessing more and more news. And I would argue that this year, our readers have become more savvy and more skeptical about the news and where they get it from. So, from that sense, there's nothing to change as such. Like, I think that the appetite for news is there, and if anything, it's growing. And the role of news to be that fourth estate has never been more important than it has in 2020. I think there's a different question though about the survivability and the economic model, if you will, that underpins news organizations. And I think that's something that we could definitely talk about today in this session.
Yes, we'll definitely get to it. Jessica, how about you?
I think that both of what the women say applies, especially in my space. I think there's another aspect of this, which is that we need to provide news to audiences that want information told differently. And I think that there's a massive audience that wants to consume content, as we've seen this year, but it's not just the business model that has to change, it's our way of speaking to our audience. And my experience has been, if you adjust that, and specifically in the area of politics, moving away from covering politics as sports, or in the idea of reaching Gen Z and millennials, that you have to take badass youngsters who've never done news and put them in cool outfits and airdrop them places. Actually, young people want to see some people of experience talking about things knowledgeably. My experience is that we need to reach the audience where they live, and then they will step up and pay for subscriptions. We're seeing this massive explosion of support for newsletter writers on Substack, support for creators on Patreon, and then finding ways to sort of take these individual voices and create enough of an umbrella that we also have sponsorship revenue. And what we're talking about is these diversified revenue streams that can go to all these more individual creators and kind of innovate both how we make money along with how we reach our audience and tell the news.
That is a great point. I want to go back, though, to what Katie said about accountability. Talk to me a little bit more about what you meant, and how do we hold ourselves accountable, and how do readers and viewers hold us accountable?
You mean how do they do it now, or how should we be doing it?
How should we be doing it? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think, boy, that's a really difficult question. I think that we need to hear more from our readers, right? And I think that to me right now feels like a pipeline that is a little bit broken, and it's so much of it is fueled by Facebook comments and Twitter responses to posts that our news outlets put on social media, or it's like trolls in the YouTube section. And I think that the fundamental nature of feedback and accountability online feels very broken to me. And I think that's something that is very resonant with regards to what Jessica was talking about on Substack, where you create much more of this sort of like one-to-one relationship between a journalist or a thinker, a writer, and their audience. And I think that creating, platforms like that are more conversational and allow for that back and forth feedback mechanism to really work again. That's fascinating to me. I mean, I think that that's something that I find very exciting and promising about the future of journalism.
Jessica, tell us a little bit about what you're doing at News Not Noise. And I want to go back to the point that you made about talking differently about news and being more relatable. I think I read an interview that you gave where you said sometimes news is a little too bro-y. What did you mean by that?
So what I do is I do the news on Instagram to an audience that's, depending on the week, 89% female or more. Ages 24 to 34 is my biggest group. And what I'm doing is I speak directly to the audience. It's not just me. I bring in other voices and I bring in content, but I'm in conversation with them all the time. They DM me and they say instantly, I didn't know what that word meant. Explain that word. Or have you seen this article? How does this relate? And I'm constantly bringing their information in and incorporating it into how I report, and what I ask experts. And the way I got here is that I spent all these years covering covering politics as a political reporter. And in DC, there was this point of view that there's like these swing voters out there. There are a lot of women. They really don't care about the politics because it's just not their thing. And I would be out there talking to them all the time on the campaign trail, and they're madly passionate about these issues. They hate the way we're talking about it. They're like, we don't care what somebody said on the Hill about the Affordable Care Act. We want to know, how much will my insurance cost? And will my kids, multiple sclerosis be covered? And so there was this ongoing disconnect that I couldn't resolve inside. Like, I failed at that. I don't blame the system, I blame me. I couldn't figure out how to do it inside. So I decided I'm going to try to see if there's a way to do this differently. Everyone told me there'd be no audience because I describe it as what I do is information, not a panic attack. Like, I'm here to give you information, not to scare the bejesus out of you. And it turns out there is an audience for this. And, I can tell you about the story and how it grew. I think that what it's proving is that people do want us to adjust how we speak, how we engage. I think Katie's absolutely right. It's about one-on-one and that connection. It's also about being responsive to what their real questions are. And I would love to touch on Facebook later in the conversation.
Can we, in building one-on-one relationships with our readers and our audience, can we also build a community that way too?
To me, yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. They police each other. I hate using that word. I wish okay. My community talks to each other. So in an Instagram post, I'll say something and some people will ask a question like, how does this relate to the Georgia recount? And 3 people will jump in and say, here's an article if you need it, or here's what I've learned. And they engage. And if somebody gets nasty or troll-like, we come in and say, you can be partisan and rude literally everywhere else on the internet. Not here, please take it somewhere else. And I modeled that early, and so they do it to each other. So I've had a post on vaccines, which is the most controversial topic on the internet. And I've had anti-vax people and scientists have like respectful conversations with each other in the comments, because that's the definition of what it means to be in this community that we created.
Anna, did you have something that you wanted to add about audience?
Yeah, I'm interested, Jessica, just as you've described it. So the way I think of the role of news for an individual is primarily to inform and to educate, right? So if I think about the various news cycles that we've had this year, as a consumer of news, I wanted to learn what is happening, right? And to educate myself. And from there, it becomes a question of like, where is the news sources that I can trust and feel comfortable with, that the news that I'm learning about is accurate. From there, though, it becomes a question to me of tone of voice and personalization. And by that, I mean, is it on the platform that I want it to be? Is it from somebody who is similar to me? Am I getting into a community where I'm going to hear opinions and perspectives that matter to me? And my question, I guess, for Jessica is like, how do you create a community that doesn't end up a thought bubble? How do you bridge that empathetic look at a variety of perspectives on something so controversial as vaccinations, but make sure you're not just promoting one argument? I don't know if that's a challenge.
I think that the challenge is to represent that there are many points of view, but not to validate each point of view as equally substantive. And in my news world, we value science. We have space for people who oppose vaccines, but they're going to know that in this space, science wins. And if you don't like that, you don't have to participate, but we do like to have the conversation, and you're welcome in the conversation. One of the things that used to make me nuts was being on panels with like 4 experts and then one person who knew absolutely nothing but was oppositional, and that one person got just as much time. I don't think that's a value add. I don't think that's journalism. I think that journalism is reflecting diversity, but we have to come down on the side of facts and truth. And if you don't like it, that's not my problem.
There's been a running debate in journalism for a couple of years now, and I think 2020 really brought it to a head. And that's the whole idea of whether both siderism is over. I see people nodding their heads. Katie, what do you think?
I mean, I'm not interested in both sides. I'm interested in the truth, right? I think that journalists, it's similar in conversations about sort of objectivity in journalism, right? It's not about both sides. It's not about this kind of false notion of all things equal, or, you know, staring down a lane and just, you know, looking at this sort of like, there's one objective truth out there. I really think that fundamentally for us at Vice, and just sort of for me personally, wherever I work as a journalist, I'm interested in the facts and the truth. And if, for example, the president of the United States is lying, we don't need to consider that as like in some equal way as we do the alternative, which is the truth. It's just, he's lying. There are not two sides to this. He is not telling the truth about something. And we as journalists are obligated, you know, by our profession and by our responsibility to our audiences to share with them what is in fact the truth and what is reality and what is real. It's not about both sides.
How do we guard against deep fakes and disinformation campaigns?
Reporting. I mean, first and foremost, I think that for a lot of news outlets, rightly so, has been a huge priority in the last few years. I think Vice does it. The New York Times has excellent reporting on that subject. I mean, I think that has been a fundamental part of political reporting in the last several years, right? And I think that there has been a great deal of progress made in how audiences understand what those things are, where they show up, how they impact politics, and how they don't. How I think some of this is maybe overblown, blown out of proportion, the impact of some, you know, pieces of that disinformation ecosystem. I really think that it is the role of journalists and journalism to unpack that for people, because it is intimidating and it can feel very technical and scary and daunting and hard to understand. So I certainly see that as the role of journalism, to be rigorous there.
Add one thing to Katie, which I fully agree. And I think it's also the additional level of explaining to the audience how disinformation operates and why it's there. So it's both exactly what she said, which is pointing it out, reporting it, and adding this larger context of this is a phenomenon we need to deal with. So I'll give you an example. I posted some disinformation and said, this is disinformation. You're going to see this circulating. I want you to know why it's disinformation. A lot of people wrote me and got mad and said, you should just call it a lie. The president's lying. Why don't you call it a lie? And I said, I want you to understand the language and what we're moving into. Disinformation is a lie with an agenda that's spread to promote a larger agenda. Please get used to this idea. And now they're using the idea back to me and sending me stuff going, I think this is disinformation. So it's a process of educating people together to help them understand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that the difficulty is that the platforms that spread the disinformation have not taken sufficient responsibility to remediate. And, you know, we can speculate as to whether it's part of their business model to let it continue or not, and whether it was accidental that they've become this platform for repeating disinformation. Be that as it may, the relevant question is what happens next. And, you know, absolutely certain that change needs to happen from within the big technology platforms.
I totally agree. And I just wanted to say, I mean, it's funny because I think, you know, covering disinformation, like a part of that beat now is covering how the tech platforms do and mostly do not respond to disinformation. It's like policing the platforms has become so often the job of the reporter and the job of the journalist. And it's almost like it's been outsourced to the media to do a lot of that heavy lifting. But I think to your point, exactly, I mean, it's what comes next. And I think there were some really interesting examples of during the election of sort of platforms taking different or new steps to combat some of this, right? So like Twitter and Facebook with these various incantations of like labels and different types of labels. I mean, it was interesting to see, and I will say for me at least, like heartening to see that there were steps taken to mitigate some of that misinformation from spreading.
Jessica, you wanted to make a point earlier about Facebook.
So my whole thing is built on a Facebook product, Instagram. And I can't tell you how many people are saying to me, I wish I could get this not on Instagram because I know what it's doing to us. I think a couple of things, like it's great that they finally are labeling things, you know, but it's too little too late. So you can find plenty of stuff that's still not labeled. And frankly, one of the biggest challenges is the algorithm itself. And so as I've tried to report out, for example, QAnon and help people understand that, the advice I've been given from experts in this is don't even engage on the substance of what people in QAnon are sharing. Explain to them what an information ecosystem is and how the algorithm is feeding them material that only reinforces what they already believe. Like, our problem is beyond facts now. It's explaining to people how these platforms are manipulating their thinking. And I have this personal conflict because I'm trying to break through that while inside it. And so I don't know what the right answer is for a provider of content, but I do think that it's an urgent imperative for our government to do something and step in because they've already proven irresponsible, reckless, and amoral in the way they run this part of the company.
I mean, I think to that point, if it makes you feel any better, it's not just you. It's for a media outlet like Vice News. It's, you know, we report on Facebook every day, and we see so clearly the missteps and the shortcomings, and yet we rely on them very much so for audience to reach our readers and for revenue. It's a huge problem. I mean, it's daunting. It is.
One of the craziest things is if a news organization wants to promote a post on any of these platforms, they promote it as a political ad. They label news itself as political ads, which is horrifying.
Katie, I wanted to get a little bit into the discussion about future platforms. Vice has really experimented over the years. Is there something that you see on the horizon that will be a new bridge to a new generation of news consumers?
Boy, I mean, it depends on what part of the world we're talking about. And I think that's a separate conversation. But I think I've been really interested as we've expanded internationally in the last 6 or 7 months, thinking about, you know, non-US audiences and non-US youth audiences as in many ways, I think the future of a lot of really interesting journalism and experiments in journalism, and sort of looking at the platforms that they're using and that they're consuming content from, instead of often looking at it through a US lens. I think that, you know, what we're looking at right now and what we're interested in thinking about in a news context is, to Jessica's points, I mean, this is her entire business, but is how do we create more of the kind of, like, I think the bridge is the one-to-one connection that we're able to make with an audience on a platform like Instagram, something like Snapchat, something like TikTok potentially as a vehicle for news, and how we can use those platforms in particular to take our reporter, take our correspondent, wherever they are in the world, and allow them to communicate directly with the audience. I mean, I really think that is the future of journalism in so many ways, is instead of just telling people, showing it to them in real time, taking them to the place where something is happening and allowing them to experience that in a very visceral and a very one-on-one way. And I think that those platforms do, at their best, allow news outlets to facilitate that.
Anna, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about technology and what your company is doing with AI and the experiments that you're going through. I know that the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and even we at CQ Roll Call have experimented a little bit in using AI in our news gathering. What potential do you see for artificial intelligence in this space?
So one of the interesting things about artificial intelligence is the role it can play in news gathering and how quickly news packages can be synthesized automatically and generated. So I've seen incredible technology that can take, for example, an NBA basketball game and package together a highlights reel within a fraction of a second based on crowd noise as being the signals for the most interesting part of the game. And so, the advantages of AI are that they can do what would take people, many, many minutes or hours long in fractions of a second. So that's on the content side of it. On the experience side, the opportunity with AI is to get that personalization, to get that one-on-one, to get that algorithm for one, if you will. So, and I think it's not just about recommending content to people based on their previous, likes and dislikes. It's also using the opportunity to suggest and to have moments of serendipity as well in terms of content. So, some people do a very good job of using artificial intelligence to propose content for the consumer, like Netflix. I think many of us would feel that Netflix and Spotify do a great job of recommending things that we may like, but also bringing us new content that we would not have otherwise found ourselves if it wasn't for the power of those algorithms. Then we could talk about other algorithms, which we just touched on, which are just structured just to keep people in their bubble. So a lot of it is not, AI is just a tool. A lot of it is how you choose to deploy it. But it's absolutely certain that it's going to have a growing and, an increasing role in both content creation and content serving.
I wanted to talk a little bit about growing a new generation of journalists. Anna, you are also a board member of the Dow Jones News Fund, which has spent decades training business reporters, copy editors, digital producers. And there are Dow Jones News Fund alums in every newsroom, including our own. We have several Dow Jones News Fund alumni, including senior writer Ellen Ferguson, who covers agriculture, news editor Andrew Menezes, and production editor Carrie Williams, who are both graduates of the copy editing program, and our insurance reporter Zoe Zagalo. What can other businesses outside of journalism learn from the Dow Jones News Fund that takes so much care in training, in growing a new generation, and really trying to be more inclusive and having a workforce that really reflects America?
So when I think about how we bring more people into journalism, I think the first step is wanting to do so, right? So step one is to make that decision that that's important to you as a news organization to be recruiting, from a diverse population. And I think then the next step, and the Dow Jones News Fund does an incredible job of this, is then giving people an opportunity and welcoming them into the platform and giving them a voice. And it's really important that Dow Jones News Fund continues to do that, but others should too. You can have a voice and a story to tell and a skill set, but without the platform, you're going to be quite alone. So I think it's about internships, it's about hiring, it's about getting different people in through the door. And then as a journalist, I think more and more the responsibility is to bring your own audience with you and to grow your own audience and reach. And I think that's something that we've talked about today as well. And another business model that I really admire is the Athletic business model, which really develops that connection and monetizes very effectively that connection between journalist and reader. And it's almost as if, if you're a journalist at the Athletic, it's you're running your own business in many ways. Like, you're directly incentivized to grow your reach. And so I would encourage journalists as well, rather than just to be given a platform and just to think that everything will flow from there, that readership will flow from there. I think it's a really individual responsibility to make sure that you're bringing audience too. And so, the audience of some of our major publications inside the United States also needs to become more diverse and inclusive as well.
Katie, what's worked for you at Vice?
In terms of recruiting,
In terms of recruiting, in terms of retention?
giving journalists the freedom and the trust to explore what they really care about. I think that, of course, with guardrails and great editing and strong leadership, which we always hope to provide, right? But I think one of the ways that we have found new beats that have resonated with our audience, or that we've found, pockets of culture coverage that we can really lean into, that has been born of recruiting and hiring from a diverse range of sources, and then giving that talent and those people some space to take risks, to cover what they tell us matters to their audience and to the demographic that they are reaching. I think that has been a major differentiator for us. But it is an ongoing challenge, and I think that the conversations around diversity in media and in journalism over the last 6 to 12 months in particular have really pushed a lot of media companies, including Vice, to think more about how we recruit and how we mentor new journalists and make them feel supported. I think the retention piece of it is a really real challenge in 2020, and with digital media in particular dealing with what it's dealing with, it can feel, I think, really difficult for journalists to feel like they have a home base somewhere that they're going to be for more than a year and a half before the next shoe drops, and for a media company in a newsroom to really have the time to invest in those journalists. I think that is a significant challenge, and it's one that when you initially asked this question a few minutes ago about this new generation of journalists, we need to give them a business model that will provide them with the stability to actually do their jobs. And that's something that I think about and worry about a lot.
So let's talk about the business model and the challenges to monetizing journalism. And I am a fan of The Athletic, and I've also noticed an incredible number of writers taking to Substack, to really become their own brand. Is there a secret sauce? Are there elements that we need to address right away? Bits and pieces that will get us toward a more stable business model?
Look, first thing is that reliance on advertising is futile. The advertisers are finding much more success just going straight to their consumers and disintermediating the news organizations in between. And quite frankly, the news cycle has not lent itself to being placed in an advertisement alongside, content that's talking about a pandemic. So, advertising, I think, should be treated as bonus revenue, not the foundation of a business model. So what you're really asking people to do is to pay directly for content. And that's the only way in which you're able to build a sustainable business. That's in terms of the revenue. I think you have to look at it also as a former CFO of a media organization, to look at it from the other side, and you have to look at your cost base. And so that has tended to be, if we look at the more successful media organizations now, they're trying not to cover absolutely everything. So to cover global news, all relevant global news, you need a cast of thousands, right? And so you're going to have people who are only making the front page of a newsprint product or the homepage of a website, only very occasionally. So the businesses that are springing up are much more focused in terms of the coverage that they're trying to cover. And in that way, they're able to control their cost base in a much more efficient way.
Jessica, it must have been somewhat terrifying to you to go out on business for yourself. How have you approached your business hat of being Jessica Yellen Inc. at News Not Noise?
First of all, I would not make that a past tense phrase. It remains terrifying. So first of all, I have a team. I have a bunch of young people who work with me. There's a bunch of other creators on board. And what I found to be the most successful thing was asking for the audience to subscribe and support. And both from a monetizing standpoint and from a validation standpoint, when I can prove that the audience is willing to pay this much to get this content, that is also validating when you go to brands to say, look, they're committed. This is not just a passing thing, we're real. But I still, I'm at one of those junctures where I have to decide, like, do I grow this way? Do I grow that way? And I'm in a new space where, there's all these structures set up to monetize audio on podcasts and monetize writing in Substack, but there isn't a thing you use to monetize video, right? Like, it's just not there yet. Unless Katie and Anna have some suggestions.
No, I was nodding. I was like, actually, she's right, there's not.
So, like, my next business thing could be create that thing, but it doesn't exist yet. And the other thing you find is, like, I started doing this video on Instagram. I started doing the stories. They went and all the news orgs started seeing what I'm doing. So they start, like, it's just, innovation rapidly expands and people start doing your thing and you have to keep growing. So there's, like, I spend my day going between, like, what's the news and, like, what's the revenue stream? What are we doing and growing into next? And it's a challenge. But the one thing that is, again, incredibly validating is I go back to how much the audience is there for it and wants to support it. And that's the safety net.
Maybe I want to go back to something that Anna said about specializing and pretty much knowing your own space. At Vice, you all have been very successful in creating individual channels that are unique. And I'm curious about how your process at Vice. When do you know how much time to give a new concept, and when do you know to say, okay, this isn't working, let's try something else?
Sure. I mean, I think for us, it can be, with something like a video series or a text series that we're just piloting, that can be a decision that is made in a week, in 2 weeks. I mean, audiences will let you know with the numbers whether something is resonating or not. I think when you're talking about a bigger strategic decision, like an entire brand, of which Vice, has launched and sustained many, that to me is an investment that you want to make for years. And I think Motherboard is a great example for Vice, where, that was a 10-year investment in really allowing those reporters to build on beats like privacy, security, transportation, and infrastructure to a place now where, to me, and I think to the audience, Motherboard is the dominant tech publication of this era. They are absolute authorities in these spaces where they had so much time as reporters and editors to develop those skills and develop that voice and, exactly what that brand is and stands for. I mean, there's real value in that, but that is a years-long calculation and a years-long commitment in my mind. You can't, trying to create something like that in a matter of weeks or months, I just think can't be done.
It's clear that change has to be embraced and innovation has to be embraced, or else, we'll die in certain quarters of the media. But, we have a few minutes left. I want to close on just one question to pose to all of you, and that is, how do you encourage change or embrace innovation, particularly if you're in a legacy media or a legacy business that still is too reluctant to take the plunge? Jessica?
You have people inside your organization that want to drive that change, let them. Full stop. I've worked in legacy media organizations I wanted to stay in, but I find very often there isn't oxygen for change from within. It has to come from, yes, full stop. And so I think that sometimes the people on top need to realize they've been doing it the same way for so many years. They're not going to understand what innovation really is hot right now. Defer to some other people who get it, and then massage them into working in the organization.
Anna, how about you?
I think it takes courage, first of all, to accept that things are changing around you and you have to be a part of it. And then I think it's just being open and listening and finding people with new ideas and bringing them in and giving them that platform.
Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what stands out is just knowing what you don't know, and getting out of the way.
I think we've had a lot of good, great ideas that you all have put forward here. I think this has been a very thought-provoking discussion about the future of news. And I know we jumped around, but I really appreciate the insight that you all have shared with us today. And I want to thank you for your time. And again, I'd like to say thank you to Jessica Yellen, Katie Drummond, and Anna Sedgley. Thank you to our audience for joining us at this discussion as part of CQ Roll Call's anniversary celebration, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Catalina, and a huge thank you to Jessica, Katie, and Anna for all your insight and perspective on where news is heading. That concludes our program today. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all our alumni and panelists for their time, and to all of you for your continued support and loyalty. Happy anniversary, CQ Roll Call.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary, CQ Roll Call.
Happy anniversary, CQ Roll Call.
Happy birthday. You don't look a day over 50.